In many ways, Brandon Ingram is exactly what the Sacramento Kings are looking for, but wanting a player and actually getting that player are two very different things. On today's Locked On Kings podcast, Jake Madison from the Locked On Pelicans podcast joins me to discuss a potential Kings Brandon Ingram deal and why it's probably unlikely.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all off-season long. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports anchor and reporter for ABC 10 News. And last week we talked about the two big, air quote, swing options for the Sacramento Kings this summer that have become available, those being Brandon Ingram or Kyle Kuzma, the safe route versus the risky route with a higher reward. Well, it's pretty easy to guess which route and which player is more of the risk. It's Brandon Ingram, right? The fact that he has only 1 year left on his deal, but the upside is there. And like I said in the introduction, in so many ways on the offensive end, the defensive end, with his size, his athleticism, his mid-range scoring, his ability as a go-to shot creator, Brandon is exactly what this Kings team needs more of. But just because he's available doesn't mean the Kings have the assets to go out and get him, or that the assets that the Kings have interest the Pelicans, who are basically in the exact same boat as Sacramento. Two teams trying to win and compete right now in the Western Conference. But instead of me breaking it all down by myself, I'm going to have Jake Madison from Locked On Pelicans join me. I don't mean to rain on your parade if you're hopeful for a Brandon Ingram trade. As you're going to hear in this conversation, it is possible. We discussed the routes in which both teams could go, what could happen on the Pelicans side that would make them more willing to make a trade with the Sacramento Kings. It's all in this discussion. If you want to weigh in and share your thoughts on the Kings going out and getting Brandon Ingram, if you think the Kings should go all in on trying to get him, or if they should just bow out completely, hit me up on the YouTube comment section down below. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, you can email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com, or head over to Twitter/X, and you can find me there at MattGeorgeSac. But for now, here's my conversation with Jake Madison. Now that the New Orleans Pelicans are done destroying the Sacramento Kings every time the two teams step on the floor together, let's be trade partners. Matt George from the Locked On Kings podcast, Jake Madison from Locked On Pelicans. Last season is last season, Jake. Bygones be bygones. Let's talk about the future. And the future of the New Orleans Pelicans and Brandon Ingram is up in the air. The future for the Sacramento Kings is entering a realm of, we know the Kings are still looking for more, and when a name becomes available, suddenly the conversations pick up. The Kings are in need of a player like Brandon Ingram with what he brings to the table, his skill set, his size, his length, his athleticism, a player that was part of the reason why the Pelicans dominated Sacramento this season. Jake, before we get into what a potential deal could look like between these two teams, give us a breakdown. What is going on in New Orleans? Why is Brandon Ingram being made available? And how aggressively do you think New Orleans is going to be looking to get a deal done?
Yeah, I think they're going to look to be pretty aggressive and to move on from Brandon Ingram. And I think the main reason here is the fit with him and Zion Williamson's just a little clunky for whatever reason. And I think they've learned, because Zion was pretty healthy this whole season, playing the most games of his career. You know, that's the guy you want to build around. And they probably beat the Lakers in that play-in tournament game, don't even play the Kings again, right? If he finishes out that game, he had 40 points and had to leave with a hamstring, which knocked him out of the playoffs. Brandon Ingram really struggled in their sweep at the hands of the Oklahoma City Thunder. He's also due a massive contract extension. This is a guy who could make 4 years, $208 million on top of the final year of his deal. I think that kind of money scares the team off a little bit. So they're going to look to move him now. You know, the main thing comes down to his lack of 3-point shooting. This is kind of an old school, mid-range, post up at times guy. And when you have Zion Williamson, who doesn't shoot threes, right? You got to have some spacing somewhere, and having your two franchise players not shoot threes, like, definitely isn't the way to do it in 2024. And I think that's the main reason why they're going to be looking to move on from Brandon Ingram. Is
the hesitation to pay Brandon more along the lines of what you're talking about, the fit with Zion, or is there hesitancy that Brandon is even worth that money potentially?
I think it's a little column A, little column B there. I think when you look at his first year in New Orleans, when he won Most Improved Player, made an All-Star game, albeit as kind of like the injury alternate for that, he was good. And he took something like, let me pull the numbers up here. He took 6.2 threes per game. And that number has gone down every year. 6.2, then 6.1, then 4.1, 3.6, 3.8. That's not ideal when you have Zion Williamson, right? And so I think it's just that, he doesn't fit the kind of modern day wing profile that you're looking for. It doesn't mean he's a bad player, right? This is a guy that still averages over 20 points per game. And despite a lot of changing lineups around him, for his first 4 years here in New Orleans was remarkably consistent, even with different shot profiles. So he can be a pretty malleable player that can fit in a variety of situations. I just don't think that this is the one where he fits. So I think it's partially that they don't want to pay someone that doesn't fit around Zion, but also he doesn't fit around Zion because of his play style. And if this was a guy who was taking 8 threes a game, I think this would be an entirely different conversation.
Knowing what you know, having watched Brandon closely over the last handful of seasons, why would you be in favor, if you were the general manager of a team, why would you be in favor of trading for him? And on the flip side, why would you be hesitant in trading for him?
Yeah, well, look, the reasons you're hesitant are the reasons they want to move on from him, right? If you need more 3-point shooting, it just doesn't seem like he's going to give you that. The Pelicans coaches have told him, you've got to shoot more threes. We need you to do this. And he just doesn't, right? There's only so much you can do. It's not like they could really bench him because of that, because he's such a talented player. So that's a big part of it. Then it's also the contract, right? Are you going to commit $208 million to that guy? I think there are certain teams that definitely would. You look at a team like the Pistons, right, that are a rumored trade team with him. They're going to have to overpay for talent if you want to put him on the Pistons there. So if he wants a max deal, yeah, you can probably get it from Detroit. Those are kind of the ways that I'm looking at it. All of that said, look, he's still a good player. I don't want to sound like I'm ragging on him or anything like that. It's just more of a fit with Zion Williamson. If you need someone to kind of be a bit of a point forward, he's really good at that. This is a guy that has led the team in assists the past 2 years here in New Orleans. He's a pretty good playmaker. He's money in that mid-range, which, look, in the postseason, that's what teams are going to give you, right? There's a reason why he averaged almost 30 points per game over a 6-game series against the Phoenix Suns a couple of years ago when the Pelicans kind of snuck in through the play-in tournament as the 8th seed. There's still talent here. He also upped his defense this past year. This was the best defensive season we've ever seen from him, and he has all of the tools to... He's never going to be elite on that side of the ball, but he can be a good defender. He can be a very good defender. He's 26 years old. He'll be 27 next season, so he's still in his prime. This is also a guy that, you just don't have any worries about. He just, breathes basketball. That's all he does, right? You never hear negative things about him in the offseason. He's just training, practicing, playing. That's what he does. He is a hooper through and through. Sometimes those are useful players to have on the team. If you can handle and stomach some of the mid-range jumpers that he takes, or maybe get him to buy into a different coach's system, if you need kind of a secondary playmaker, this is a very, very good player to have.
A lot of the things you listed off there are why he's such an enticing option for the Sacramento Kings. And I feel like the Kings are not necessarily alone in that. I am under the impression, Jake, that there is going to be absolutely a market for Brandon Ingram. There's 100% going to be interest around the league in a Brandon Ingram deal. The hesitancy is going to be in a potential 1-year rental. Ingram has only 1 year left on his deal. In addition to having to fork out the money to pay him, you run the risk of losing him for nothing, and you just rented him for 1 year, which is something I know the Sacramento Kings would be looking to avoid. This is maybe an unfair question, kind of a strange question, putting yourself kind of in the brain of Brandon from covering him over a couple of years. Does he strike you as the type of person that could harm the Pelicans in any kind of way with preventing a deal from going through by saying or having his camp or his agent saying, like, we're not re-signing there. Like this was a good example would be the Pascal Siakam situation this past season. The Kings were very, very close to landing Pascal Siakam. The rumor was he was not going to re-sign with the Sacramento Kings, so they weren't willing to make the deal. I have a feeling if Brandon were to do the same thing, the Kings would be hesitant.
Yeah, right. Like that's a big concern with all of this, right? That's where it's kind of tough to gauge his market. You know, if the Pelicans wanted to move him, it probably would have been better to do it a year ago where there's like a little bit more runway on that deal. And that's how you kind of get the maximum return on some of these players that aren't like an Anthony Davis level guy who had 1 year left on his deal when the Pelicans traded him then. That's a big part of it. My kind of assumption on this, and I'll go into kind of like thinking like Brandon Ingram in a second here, is any team trading for him kind of assumes they're going to pay him that max deal. And I think he'll take a max deal. I think you could send him anywhere and he will take that max deal, right? Like Detroit, sure. Sacramento, sure. Whatever other teams that come up, I think if you give him that max deal, he will sign it. And so I think teams trading for him just know that that's kind of built into what you're doing here. So it's not just trading for Brandon Ingram, it's trading for him and, 5 more years of Brandon Ingram is how they're looking at it. It depends on what you think he's worth and if you're willing to kind of commit to that contract for him. I don't think there's going to be a situation where he's like, I won't re-sign here with New Orleans, like send me out. By all accounts, from everything I understand about him and talking to people around him, he likes it here. He likes it in New Orleans. There's something to be said for a dude who is happy in a market that no one really seems to want to play in, right? This happens in these small markets, right? That's kind of part of what it comes to with covering these teams, right? They want to go play in big glamour markets, let's say. That's not New Orleans, so the fact that he's happy here, there's part of me that's like, give him a max deal because you don't always get guys like that, right? So if they're willing to commit to those teams, I do think that can be an important thing. And even if it's a max deal, that might not be a bad thing for that.
Like I said at the top of the show, today's episode of Locked On Kings is brought to you by Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. With over 5 million members, that's a real number. It is the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your money. With Prize Picks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're locked in. Hey, let's say you're doing it for the NBA Finals, right? The way it works, let's say you pick Luka Doncic to score more than 31.5 points. You pick Jason Tatum to score more than 27.5 points. You choose Jaylen Brown to have more than 2.5 steals. And finally, you pick Kyrie Irving to have less than 8.5 assists. You hit on all 4 of those, you're getting a big payday. It's so much fun. I played it all season long around the Sacramento Kings. Of course, you can play it with baseball. You can play it with NFL football and college sports when they return. So many fun and amazing and exciting ways to play on Prize Picks. So if you're interested in playing, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, let's talk about the Kings and Pelicans as potential trade partners. From the Sacramento perspective, of course, Brandon Ingram becomes available and the Kings immediately, the interest is up there, and Monty should already be working the phones if he hasn't already. But from the Pelicans perspective, from New Orleans' perspective, when you think landing destinations, more importantly, teams with assets that the Pelicans could potentially land in a Brandon Ingram deal, where are the Kings on the Pelicans' radar, New Orleans' radar?
Depends. You going to trade Fox over here? Because we can get a deal done right now. Like we can lock this up. The show can be over, and we can go on with our day. But I'm assuming that's not going to be the case.
Nope.
Then it becomes a little bit harder, right? Then it becomes a little bit harder, I think, because the Pelicans are in win now mode, right? Like this is not something where, cool, we'll send you 4 draft picks, right? Like that's not what they want. They don't need that. They have a ton of draft picks. They have their own. They have another one from the Lakers. They have ones from Milwaukee. They have no need for more first round picks. So you have to get this deal done for players. So they need to be players that fit around Zion Williamson. But I think it's not just depth, right? You're not going to trade Brandon Ingram for parts in a sense, I think. And that's where it gets a little bit tough to try and kind of figure out a deal with the Sacramento Kings. One of the teams that I've been looking at a lot on Locked On Pelicans is the Atlanta Hawks. If they're going to trade one of DeJounte Murray or Trae Young, that's going to trump a deal that's kind of built around like Harrison Barnes, Herter, and like a couple of other pieces, right? So it comes down to trying to figure out how to get that deal done. And that's why I think it's a little bit more difficult with the Sacramento Kings than maybe some of the other teams that are potentially going to be in the running for Brandon Ingram.
And to add another layer to it too, Jake, these are two teams that are directly competing with one another right now. I mean, these are two teams that are trying to win and literally met in the play-in tournament. Two teams, if we're making a tier list in the Western Conference, they're probably on the same tier.
Yeah,
so
I agree with that.
It's a very interesting situation too, where you're potentially trading or swapping assets with, I wouldn't go as far as to call them a rival, but a team that you're probably going to continue to clash with going into next season and in future seasons, depending upon how the development of these two organizations goes. But leverage, of course, is everything in these situations, Jake. And here's where my Sacramento perspective comes into play, where I hear what you're saying about Atlanta. And if one of those two guys is available and the Pelicans could potentially get either of them, yeah, I would say screw you to any Kings deal that the Kings put out there. That being said, it's not like New Orleans is in a perfect situation, at least from my perspective here, because it's very well known they do not want to pay Brandon. They do not want to have to be in a position where they're forced to pay him or lose him, which other teams are going to take advantage of. I wonder if draft picks and role-playing, and there can be role-playing starters, but filler pieces are maybe going to be the best case scenario the organization could get the longer this goes on.
Yeah, potentially, right? Like, one of the things I've kind of been looking at a lot is like, when do these deals get done, right? Like, obviously, the draft is kind of like the first one, right? It's the NBA. There's a reason the trade deadline gets active like a day before the trade deadline. They just need these kind of like time limits on things to kind of force GMs to make deals. And if draft picks are going to be involved, the draft is there. But then you look at a deal like Donovan Mitchell, right? Like, he wasn't traded till a month before training camp started. His deal was in September. So I do think there's potential that this could drag on. And I don't know if that increases or decreases the Pelicans' leverage when it comes to something like that. I also think they're open to re-signing him. Like, I don't think it's like we've got to get rid of Brandon Ingram. I think they're going to scour the league and canvass the league for a trade, but I don't think they're looking at this like we have to do this. I don't think they'll go into next season with him on the roster, not on an extension. And while they don't want to give him a max, he definitely did some damage to his trade value. And if no team wants to give him a max, if you can re-sign him for less than a max, I think the Pelicans would be willing to do that. Because if you do that, and you could then trade him later by the trade deadline if it doesn't work, and now he's on a new deal. So there's potential that this drags out longer, I think. They need to kind of do that earlier on in free agency, within like the first 2-3 weeks of free agency, because you've got to wait 6 months before you can trade a guy, depending on the deal that you give him. And that kind of puts them right around that February trade deadline date. But I think there's potential for that too. Maybe they just go, okay, there's no deal out there. Our backs are to the wall. We got to give them that $208 million, and they do. I don't think that's what you want. But again, it's a small market, and sometimes you have to overpay for talent. And he's still a productive player. I think they really hope that if New Orleans adds a new starting center, Jonas Valanciunas being gone, that maybe unlocks these guys. And Brandon Ingram in his end of season media availability, like, definitely kind of looked like a dude who had done some introspection and is like, I need to change my style of play. And if he shoots more threes, he can fit around Zion Williamson really well. So I don't think, as you said, it's a leverage thing, right? Like, there's a lot of these kind of, like games within the game, in a sense, to use a cliche or something like that, when it comes to all of this. So I agree with you that, if Trae Young's not available, Murray's not available, if Donovan Mitchell signs an extension with the Cavaliers, right? That's taking a lot of team, and the Warriors even just kind of came out and were like, we don't want Brandon Ingram, right? Which is like, huh? You look at that and it's like, okay, if you're only going to get role players back, I think the Pelicans are going to look to just re-sign him.
So what you're saying makes complete logical sense. I'm wondering, kind of dipping into the emotional side, like going into the brain of Jake Madison and even the brain of New Orleans Pelicans fans who understand they're in a win now mode, and very similar to Sacramento. I'm sensing there's a feeling of we can't just run this thing back in New Orleans. Like the West is too good to just run this back. How does that play into the, yes, they could go the patient route, but they don't necessarily want to.
It depends, right? I think it depends on how you're selling a new starting center. That could be a big upgrade. It might not be, right? If they trade a couple draft picks and get a guy like Jared Allen, and your starting lineup is CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, Herb Jones, Zion, and Jared Allen, that's a significant difference than having Jonas Valanciunas there. So if you can get him, can you get a Miles Turner? I think if it's only role players coming back for Brandon Ingram, they're going to kind of shift their focus to using a lot of those future draft picks that they have for themselves and these other picks to, that Lakers pick in theory maybe could be valuable next year. I'm not entirely sure yet. I think they're going to look to kind of shake up their roster in a dramatic way in that fashion, or even look to move on from CJ McCollum and kind of gauge his value a little bit around the league before they just completely give up on Brandon Ingram. But you also have that ticking clock of, well, if he's not going to sign an extension with us, and I don't think he wouldn't, it's got to be for the right money. You've got to do it by a certain time. Otherwise you lose even more leverage by the day if you go into the season with him on an expiring deal. So I think they want to make a big change. This team, I can assure you, wants to make a big change. David Griffin, the executive vice president of basketball operations, even said that publicly, right? He's like, we aren't good enough. And you make a real good point here, Matt, of like, if you're not getting better, you're regressing, right? If you stay the same in the West, you're regressing. Look at what happened to the Kings, right? From kind of 1 year to the next, right? You went from being the 3 seed to the play-in tournament with all of that. You've got to get real good because it is a massive arms race out there. And I think the Pelicans, I see it, the fans see it, the front office sees it, that they weren't good enough this year. They were healthy and they weren't good enough. There's going to be dramatic changes. I still think that if it's Brandon Ingram, I want to say for parts, right? Harrison Barnes isn't just parts, right? He's a good player. And as you said, kind of with role-playing starters. And if they fit around Zion Williamson, that can go a long way. I still think they're going to look to kind of really change things up in other ways that kind of have that same big impact and at least do that first. One of the ways I've talked about it is, it's like when you're triaging something, right? Your back hurts. You just don't run into back surgery necessarily. It's try stretching, right? Try some medication, try some other things, and then you hit there. So I think the way the Pelicans are going to look at this is, let's try a new starting center. Okay, that didn't work. Let's fire our head coach. Okay, that didn't work. Now we're going to break up Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson unless, hey, there's just the right deal out there that makes sense to do this now.
I'll be honest with you, Jake, the longer this conversation goes, the less and less confident I am in any kind of deal getting done, simply because these two teams are in such similar situations that...
Yeah, it's weird, right?
I just don't know how willing they'll be able to play ball with one another. Both sides, in my opinion, one side has exactly what the other side needs, which is Brandon Ingram for the Sacramento Kings. The other side doesn't have anything that Pelicans really need, with the exception of a superstar that in no chance is getting traded in De'Aaron Fox necessarily, right? So I trying to work out the frameworks of this deal. Maybe the best that the Pelicans can get on the market this summer is a 2 first-rounders, Harrison Barnes / Kevin Huerter package with Davion Mitchell thrown in. I don't know how everything works out, but something like that. Maybe that's the best that they could get this summer. And if that's the case, I don't know if the Pelicans would say okay, or would just say it ain't worth it. Let's stall it a little bit longer and see where we can go.
So I have a question for you, and let me comment on what you just said first. Is, a lot of this kind of hinges on a variable that we just don't know and have no control about, and that's what would Brandon Ingram re-sign for in New Orleans? If he's I'm not going to take a penny less than the max, this conversation is very different than it was before, because if they're we're not going to do that, you have to go forward with a trade, and you've just got to kind of take what you can get. It goes back to the leverage piece of everything. Until we kind of have more insight on that, it's tough to figure out exactly what his value around the league is going to be. Let me ask you this, though, in terms of players' pieces, is Keegan Murray on the table at all?
For me, and I believe I'm on the same page as the Kings organization, I say absolutely not. I just don't feel that And it's not that Keegan is untradeable necessarily, but I think it's redundant. You're especially for the risk of for losing Brandon Ingram, and the Kings believe, whether it's real or not, I know for a fact the Kings believe that Keegan has the potential to turn into everything that Brandon Ingram can be, or maybe even a little bit better than that. No idea if it's going to actually happen, but I do genuinely feel that the Sacramento belief is that Keegan is exactly what the Kings need more of. So to do a 1-for-1 swap doesn't make sense.
Okay. No, I was just kind of curious. Like, I think you could build a package around something like that, because that's a starter quality player who at least now isn't as good as Brandon Ingram when it comes to certain things.
Correct.
So, but a guy that you can kind of include in your core group of things. So I think that's something that could intrigue the Pelicans a little bit. But if he's not on the table, like right, we're building a trade that's centered around Harrison Barnes at that point. Right.
And I think draft picks, essentially.
Yeah.
Yes.
And look, the draft picks can come to New Orleans. They can then move that for other pieces. Who knows? Maybe it's CJ and a bunch of draft picks for DeJounte Murray or something like that. And your starting lineup then is Murray, Herb Jones, Harrison Barnes, Zion, and something. I don't know if that's like going to be that. Is that big of a shakeup to New Orleans in the way, or does that make them worse? And that's where, just kind of talking it out with you, right? Like, I think we're having trouble trying to see how the kind of like stars would align for something like this. That's not to say that it won't. And it's just going to kind of depend on the market out there, I think. And like, we still don't know what that is, right? We've heard reports that Brandon Ingram's going to have a bigger trade market than Trae Young. Like, if that's going to be the case, like, the offers seem like they would be high for Brandon Ingram then, but I'll kind of believe that when I see it too, which then means maybe they need to do a deal. So I don't know. It's hard, man.
I just think the Kings in a Brandon Ingram trade would be relying on, in a way, things not going right for New Orleans. Meaning,
that's a good way to put it.
Meaning, Brandon's asking for the max. Everything that they're looking for, they can't get anything better, and they're feeling the pressure of, we got to do something. We got to try and maximize this now and avoid paying him and kind of getting ourselves stuck. So I think it's just a lot has to go right for Sacramento before this trade even happens for it to happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So would you give Brandon Ingram a max? Like, you personally, you're looking at this. Is that what you would do, kind of looking at, I don't know the Kings obviously as well as you do, right? Mm-hmm. So knowing that small markets sometimes have trouble attracting talent, right? Would you give him a max?
See, that's another wrinkle to this conversation too, because the Kings are coming up on a payday for Keegan Murray, assuming Keegan's not involved in this deal. Mm-hmm. They are still trying to bring Malik Monk back, although there's a set amount that they can bring him back for. They have a payday coming for De'Aaron Fox too, because he's waiting for his supermax that he's going to potentially be able to sign in a couple of years. He turned down a contract extension, according to reports recently, because he thinks and he knows he can get a lot more money on the open market. I'm also under the belief, Jake, that this is the state of the Western Conference, right? Like, you got to spend money, and you have to be willing to go into the luxury tax and maybe go deep into the luxury tax if you truly want to contend. It's kind of a put up or shut up time, I think, for both teams, but especially in the position of the Sacramento Kings, right? If there's any hesitancy to want to spend money, and we've kind of seen it recently with the Kings and their extension for Mike Brown. They were hesitant to give him $10 million a year, which is the market value for coaches right now. Like, there was hesitancy there.
Yeah, thank you, Monty Williams, for that. He got so many people paid.
Whew, you're not kidding. But obviously, that's coaching and players are completely different.
Yeah.
You have a record-breaking TV deal that's about to be signed. The salary cap is only going to go up and up and up and up and up. That being said, like, you have to spend money. And if you truly think that you're a Brandon Ingram piece away with this core of actually legitimately competing, like, I'll be completely transparent with you, Jake. If this Brandon Ingram trade happened tomorrow, I'm not labeling the Kings as a championship contender going into next season. They haven't proved it yet. But I think they should be in the conversation for a top 4 team in the Western Conference again. But like, regardless, if you're rolling the dice with this team, you have to put the money up in advance. You have to pay initially. There is no waiting to see if it works and then backing up the truck, in my opinion. So it's a roundabout way of answering your question of, would I pay Brandon Ingram the max? I have my hesitancies, just like I think everybody else does, but I don't know a better option for Sacramento if they're really, truly trying to make a big move.
No, it's that, right? Like, it's just, sometimes you just got to do it, right? It's $208 million too much for him. Yeah, probably. But like, what else are you supposed to do?
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of that, not be competitive in the West. Like, no one wants that. It's also not my money. I don't own the team. Right. Like, it's easy. It's easy for us to say spend and do that. It's not always the realities of the situation, but like, yeah, like that's why, like, I kind of look at it and like, do I want to give him a max here? No. If it was that or lose him for parts, let's say, I'm going to give him the max and I'm going to just see if we can find a way to make this work.
Yeah. I don't know. I like the idea of it. The conversation that we've been having here, Jake, I love your 2 cents on this too, even though it has nothing to do with New Orleans. It's been kind of a Kyle Kuzma versus Brandon Ingram conversation. And Brandon Ingram is the better player by far. Kyle Kuzma already under contract. The contract is a good one. It goes down $2 million per year over the remainder of the contract, so you don't have to worry about that. He can fill more of a role versus Brandon Ingram coming in and kind of being a part of the main entree of Sacramento's offense. So Kyle Kuzma is the safer route. But does safe get you where you need to be in the Western Conference? That's the whole thing. If you're not trying to compete in the West, or you're not truly putting yourself in a position to win in the Western Conference, then what the hell are you doing? And that's the hesitancy for me of going a Kyle Kuzma or a safer route versus a Brandon Ingram route. No,
that makes like tons of sense. Like, that makes tons of sense, right? And I think when you kind of put him in the vacuum, you pick Brandon Ingram every single time. It comes down to maybe some of the money with that too. And one of the things, like, I tell my listeners on the show when I'm like, they're going to, let's look at the cheaper option here, because that's kind of what the team does, right? Like, it's not as fun to do that, but sometimes the more realistic one that we've got to take into account with that. So when you're kind of comparing these two players, like, sometimes that's the tiebreaker when it comes to it. That descending contract on Kuzma, even if Kuzma isn't as good, is maybe like the route that the Kings are going to go, which is kind of disappointing in a sense, but I get it.
Shot in the dark here before we wrap up. You think any possibility of a Herb Jones conversation to be had with these two teams as well? That's
no.
What I figured.
He like how you kind of look at like Murray and some of these other guys. It's like, yeah, I don't know if he's tradable now. His contract's incredible. Mm-hmm. Like that deal they signed, paying more like kind of sooner for him. They could have kept him on that rookie deal. Looks like a very smart move for the Pelicans. I don't think I've ever liked a player on the team as much as I like Herb Jones too. So like, that's part of it, that there's like a little bit of like sentimentality to it, but like, no, I would not get Herb Jones. I was literally out this weekend trying to find a Herb Jones alternate jersey to like buy for myself, is how much I like the player.
This is the problem that the Sacramento Kings face. What the Kings are looking for and what the Kings need more of is exactly what every single team in this league covets. It's a really tough spot to be in, and the only way to get through it, I think, is to take the risk. Is Brandon Ingram that risk? I don't know. I don't know if the Pelicans can even humor what the Kings are willing to do, unless the Kings are feeling so risky as to include Keegan Murray in the deal. But I certainly wouldn't do that. Jake, thank you so much for your time, for your perspective on this entire thing. We'll see if any of this comes into fruition. If the smoke around this heats up a little bit and the conversations get deeper, we'll revisit this and hash it out a little bit more. But I appreciate you taking the time, my man.
Of course. Always happy to do it, man.